is the sprawling city of Karachi, the commercial capital of Pakistan and an important port. But 430 kilometers north along the Indus was once another city which was the bustling heart of a civilization over 4,000 years ago. Mohenjo-Daro. In this episode of Lost Cities, we access some rare pictures and views of the city, taking you on a tour of it with Pakistani archaeologist and author Parveen Talpur, who was part of the team that catalogued the material from the last excavation in Mohenjo-Daro in 1965. She went on to research the Indus Valley civilization at Cornell University in the US and has written numerous books on Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Valley civilization. This is an aerial view of Mohenjo-Daro. The iconic protrusion that you see dominating the landscape is what remains of a much later Kushan-era stupa, which would have been built only about 2,000 years ago. The rest of the city goes back to between 2600 and 1900 BCE. Interestingly, what you see in the site today is just 1/3 of the city. 2/3 of it is still buried underground and has not been excavated. From the size of the city, we know that in its prime, Mohenjo-Daro was one of the biggest cities of the Indus Valley civilization. What worked for it was its location.
I think Upper Sindh was the most logical location for Mohenjo-Daro, the largest city of Indus civilization, to emerge and to flourish. Of course, the main reason is the river itself. But then the coincidence that the river traversed from this most fertile patch of Sindh, that makes a difference. It boosted the agriculture. There might have been surplus production, which gave enough time to the inhabitants to indulge in finer aspects of life, creativity, spirituality, craftsmanship. And then there were roads leading to Mohenjo-Daro. So it had access to transport its goods, its raw materials, its crafts, and even its ideas to distant lands. And because there were not only roads, there were the river traffic. The river was quite close, and the people can bring the goods to Mohenjo-Daro, and then they could be transported through River Indus towards the Arabian Sea coast. From there, through maritime routes, they went to the Persian Gulf and as far as Mesopotamia. So there were lots of routes in this whole network. I think Mohenjo-Daro had a very central position. So it had the commercial significance. It was also, obviously, in that context, a cultural hub, and also the administrative headquarters. We do not know much about the administration and how it was controlled, this whole civilization, but being the largest city, whatever the system was, it had to be centered at Mohenjo-Daro. We don't know what kind of ruling authority was there. Was it male or female? Was it a theocracy? Was it democracy? Was it a matriarchal system? After all, we have found so many mother goddesses figurines over there. So we don't know much about the administration and the ruling authority, but it seems that logically Mohenjo-Daro has to be the center of all that.
For much of history, Mohenjo-Daro remained hidden. It was about 100 years back that archaeologist Dr. R.D. Banerjee connected the objects that he found here to the site of Harappa, and with it the Indus Valley civilization. Banerjee, who was with the Archaeological Survey of India, had come to study the stupa here. Until then, Mohenjo-Daro was just one of the many mounds scattered around Sindh.
The locals did not had any memory of the city that had once lived under that mound. They just simply called it, and I guess they had been referring to it since generations, as Mohenjo-Daro, which is a Sindhi word which means mound of the dead. And that actually became the name of the city. Obviously, it got anglicized, but that's what it means. And it is strange, because in rural Sindh there are lots of mounds, and they have certain name. Like for instance, before Mohenjo-Daro, Kahu-Jo-Daro was excavated. Now Kahu has to be somebody's name. Kahu-Jo-Daro means mound of Kahu. Then Chanhu-Daro means mound of Chanhu. Joder-Chodaro. But somehow this site must have been so ancient that people even forgot the actual name and they started referring to it as Mohenjo-Daro. So there was an element of fear and in fact a superstition. I don't remember where, but in one of the original sources it has been mentioned that there was this superstition that if anybody climbs this mound, he or she will turn blue. Perhaps that worked and it kept the treasure seekers away, and the city was preserved for so many centuries for the archaeologists to come and excavate it. When Banerjee saw it for the first time, he describes it as a mound which is about 70 to 80 feet high, and it was actually standing between the waves of smaller mounds. Now these smaller mounds, some of these you can still see if you go to the site, and if you excavate these, perhaps there are more structures under these.
Between 1922 and 1965, a series of excavations were carried out on the site of Mohenjo-Daro, and they have helped us imagine how the city would have been. Many objects that we know today as iconic symbols of the Indus Valley or Harappan civilization were found here. Take for example the famous priest king of Mohenjo-Daro. Here is a photograph from the excavation in the 1920s which captured the moment when the priest king rose from the ruins of his old city. The dancing girl of Harappa was found in the lower city in one of the houses here. Mohenjo-Daro is hauntingly beautiful, and Parveen Talpur takes us back in time with some rare pictures.
To me, it looks otherworldly, especially in the glow of the rising sun in the morning. When the bricks turn little reddish, it really looks like Martian. That's why I'd say that to me it looks otherworldly. When you reach Mohenjo-Daro, at the first sight, you do not see any form. No architectural features are visible unless you really enter the city. So for instance, if you look at it from the museum and you start walking towards the pathway, the first thing that you'll realize that there is a raised part of the city. You can only figure out that there is a fragment of a circular wall on its tip. But when you enter it, gradually you will notice that there are stubs of pillars. By the way, all the structures are roofless. That's another thing, that you don't see much form in it. And then you also see the stupa, which is still the highest structure over there. You see the platform on which it stands, and then just very close to it is the Great Bath. You can see the stairs going deep. It's 8 feet deep pool. You can also notice that it is very geometrically constructed structure. It's the pool, but around it you can see balconies, monks' quarters. You can figure out, obviously, these are again roofless structures. So there's this whole quadrangle. That area is known as the Great Bath area, which belongs not to the Buddhist Koshan period, but it belongs to the Indus period. There was a pillared hall. You can figure out where those stubs of pillars that you can see. And whatever buildings are there, they are actually the public buildings used for administration or for religious or ritualistic purposes. Then the next part is residential area, which is low-lying, and both these parts are divided by a large area, which could be an old creek or an old bed of Indus itself. We are not sure, but they are divided, and that area is low-lying. If you start from the main street, again, the first thing that you will realize is that it is very straight, geometrically done, geometrically precise, and then the narrow streets. The streets, by the way, are very narrow according to today's standards, but again, very you see geometry all around you. The streets are straight and they crisscross at right angles. There are drains that run parallel with the streets. Even the building blocks, the brick itself, the bricks are all uniformed. They are standard size, not very different from what we use today in Sindh. So you get a good sense of geometry. There is an empty lot over there. It could be a marketplace, it could be a playground. There are shops, houses with multiple rooms, some of them double stories with staircases, some of them having their own private wells. The wells are also brick lined, and the bricks used for the lining of the wells are wedge shaped. There is also an industrial area in which you can see the pits. Perhaps they were used for, and these pits are arranged in a row. They may have been used for dyeing the fabric or for tanning leather. So basically these are the structures that you notice, and you notice a lot of geometry in all these features. It is at this citadel mound area where you can scan two periods of time. One belongs to the historic period, which has the Buddhist stupa, and it belongs to the Koshan period. And then you have the ancient period of Indus civilization. So you can see both these periods together in the citadel mound. That's what makes it very interesting. I like entering it from the main street. I like that. It's a very broad street. I think it was Mortimer Wheeler again who compared it with the city. And it is said that 3 bullock carts can pass side by side in this street easily. And then also Banerjee's description about a street that ends at the edge of the river, that gives you a good picture of the city, and that was actually the south end of the city. Most of the houses were built at the south end, and they stood opposite to the citadel mound area. So you get a very good picture from these descriptions, and when you actually see it, then obviously it becomes even more fascinating to you. Again, the streets crisscrossing each other at right angles, drains running parallel to it, river on one side, fields on the other side. There were roads that led to other cities. There was a river that led right to the Arabian Sea coast. We can picture it through these, that how the trade, the cargo was transported, how the merchandise was carried from one place to another, what was the means, the bullock carts, the boats, all these things.
The city of Mohenjo-Daro was closely connected to the Indus for its survival. The agricultural produce and the artifacts produced here would have been carried down the river to the sea and then to the markets of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro have revealed that the site was occupied between 2600 and 1900 BCE for a period of 700 years. So what would life have been like during this period?
I visualize it as a very busy city with a very brisk trade. People from all sorts of life, the farming community, the fishing community, the craftsmen, boat makers, bead makers, jewelers, blacksmiths, think of anything, wood carvers. So what I visualize is, for instance, when I see the industrial area where there is this row of pits, which archaeologists feel that perhaps they used to dye fabrics there. We can imagine it like a very organized dhobi cart, more organized than what we have in present days, not that chaotic. And then, for instance, Laila Shehzada, a world-renowned artist, she had visualized Mohenjo-Daro in her own way, and she had painted beautiful paintings, especially of the women, because in archaeological records we don't see any record of the women. They hardly exist on the margins of history, even in later history. So I visualize that women, for instance, like in what Laila Shehzada calls the potter's daughter, I visualize that the potters are working and their daughters sitting next to him doing the fine work, not actually working on the wheel but on the designs of the pottery. In the same way, embroidery and bead jewelry still in rural Sindh, these are the things which are done by women. So I also visualize that when we say we have discovered bead factories actually at Lothal and at Mohenjo-Daro, I always imagine women working on these beaded jewelry. Of course, there was goldsmiths also, the blacksmiths also. So we have a picture of a very busy city and a very prosperous and happy city. I think there was a lot of entertainment, not only because of one dancing girl, but we have discovered masks. So maybe some kind of a theatrical activity. They had a certain concept of theater. So they had these shows. And even the children, they were entertained, I think. And children themselves, they might have made so many figurines, birds, male and female figurines, like the village kids in Sindh, they still make. So I think lots of activities, and then coming out of the city, in the fields, on the roads, I imagine bullock carts coming from because in the later texts, when you see the description of the roads, there are special roads just made for the cattle, for the bullock carts. So bringing in and out the produce from the fields, and also the goods coming from other Indus civilization cities. For instance, flint was imported to Mohenjo-Daro. What was exported from Mohenjo-Daro to Rohri, we do not know. But Rohri is one place where there was this inland trade. There was Mohenjo-Daro. Beads were made there, and maybe they came to Mohenjo-Daro, and then something went towards Mohenjo-Daro in exchange. They may have some barter system or whatever, and which then on the larger scale, it goes to the river and through the river waterways and other cities, all this network. And just imagine Mohenjo-Daro at the center of this whole network, and then it extends as far as Mesopotamia through maritime routes.
While the river Indus acted as a spine around which Mohenjo-Daro grew and prospered, it was also a source of great anguish. This is a recent visual of the flooding of the Indus, a much too regular phenomenon that continues to cause great damage.
Indus is notorious for changing courses, and so are its tributaries. Just behind my village is one of the ancient most tributary, and you can guess from its name, it's known as Puran. Puran was the easternmost tributary of river Indus. It was active until the times of Alexander the Great. In fact, there is a legend that perhaps Alexander the Great, on his way back, sailed through Puran. Anyway, Puran gets flooded, and so we imagine even Indus itself, when it gets flooded, havoc it must be causing to the villages and the city in its vicinity. So it happened because of Puran, and during those flood days, my father spoke about the floods that he had seen, the similar floods, when he was a little boy. So it seems that after every few decades or maybe a century, Puran it causes havoc, and so does Indus. So in Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists have identified 7 layers of occupation, and perhaps these happened because the inhabitants had to move out of the city, and when the water receded, they came back, they rebuilt it, reconstructed it, and that is how layer after layer was built. There is not much change of artifacts from the beginning to the end of these layers. That's why we don't think that there was any that the displacement happened due to any other reason like an invasion or anything. It was due to the floods. And this is, I think, a psychology of human beings, that when we moved out from our village and all the villagers were settled temporarily near the irrigation canal, which is the raised ground, even my father thought that let's build a new village here and start living here because we are very close to the Puran otherwise. But after, I think when the water receded and people started to go back to their homes to get some stuff, they thought they became nostalgic or something happened, and even my parents wanted to go back to their old house and reconstruct it and start living there. So we never made a new village. We started living back in that village. And I always imagine that this must have been to Mohenjo-Daro inhabitants also at multiple times.
In fact, even today, the area is at risk. There are growing concerns about the rising water table in the region and the risk it poses to the still buried city under it. Almost 2/3 of Mohenjo-Daro remains buried. There have been no excavations on the site since 1965.
There were 3 main reasons for that. The first was the water logging. The second was the salinity problem, which is a problem all over Sindh. I have seen with my own eyes, even modern structures, falling victim to salinity. They get corroded by the salt-borne air and the exposure to the air. So the exposed architectural remains of Mohenjo-Daro, they have a salt-borne air which corrodes the bricks. And then there is the water logging problem, which is underground and which is, damaging the founder. And the third threat from the itself, it's changing course, which had happened in the past at Mohenjo-Daro. Now, in 1965, when George Dales was excavating Mohenjo-Daro, he did borings at 3 specific points, and he discovered that one of the borings showed that there was a human occupation which was 39 feet deep, which means that we have structures which can be that deep, which can take us back in history in times more older than the Mohenjo-Daro period itself. But unfortunately, we cannot do that after 1965 because these were submerged. Actually, the waterlogging problem was detected by Mortimer Wheeler in 1950 when he realized the moisture on the bed of the trench that he was working, and he had brought it to the notice of the authorities. And by 1965, when George Dales was working, I already mentioned that the water table had risen so much that now we could not go further. The problem of water logging had started with the construction of Sakhar Barrage. Sometime in the early 20th century it was constructed, and it was a big blessing for the agricultural community. The landlords around that region, they got a good opportunity to do the paddy cultivation, which was more productive, but it required standing water. So the standing water of the paddy fields and the extra water, the excess of water in the area, which was collected because of the Sakhar Barrage, all these factors, they contributed in the rising of the water table underground. So that is why the underground structures cannot be excavated. Now, mind you, what we are seeing, according to one estimate, we are seeing only 1/3 of the city of the Mohenjo-Daro. 2/3 are still submerged in the waters. In 1973, the government of Pakistan, the Department of Archaeology especially, they had made a master plan which they presented to UNESCO. And then UNESCO declared Mohenjo-Daro as an endangered site because of these 3 threats. In the master plan, there were suggestions how to control these, how to control the rising water table, and how to suck the water which is already collected there. So one of the suggestions was the installation of tube wells, and hundreds of tube wells were installed which sucked the water from underground and drained it in the Dadu Canal, which is another irrigation canal closer to Mohenjo-Daro. So I guess still Mohenjo-Daro is under threat, and people are preserving with mud plaster at the most, whatever they can do, that is being done.
After the site was discovered by Dr. R.D. Banerjee, Mohenjo-Daro was excavated by some of the leading archaeologists. The last excavation of Mohenjo-Daro was conducted by Dr. George Dales from the University of Pennsylvania in 1965. After that, excavations here were banned. The cataloguing of all that Dales and team found was done in the early 80s, and Parveen Talpur was part of the team that catalogued the material that was unearthed.
I met George Dales at a UNESCO symposium sponsored by UNESCO in collaboration with government of Pakistan. George Dales was the director of South Asia and Southeast Asia Department of the University of California, Berkeley. And he was the last archaeologist who had excavated Mohenjo-Daro in 1965, because after that the excavations had been banned. So I'm talking of 1979. So he came after these many years actually to examine, catalog, and write a book on the artifacts that he had discovered. And he eventually wrote Excavations of Mohenjo-Daro, the pottery of Mohenjo-Daro. It was specifically on the pottery of Mohenjo-Daro. I think it was a very important book which was published later in 1988. But before that, when he wanted to catalog and examine, he had to work in Pakistan at the Department of Explorations and Excavations, where all his artifacts were stored. So I was very excited that everything was in Karachi. So I asked him if I can work with his team, and he was very kind. He gave me the opportunity to work with the American team in Pakistan, which was a big thing at that time, especially for a woman to do. So I was very happy about all that. So my experience was I was obviously a novice. The first thing I saw these artifacts in black cotton bags, the string bags, and then there were tables laid for the whole team to work, different tables. It was a big hall at the excavation and exploration branch of the archaeology department. And these bags, the string was loosened, and the artifacts were thrown into a tray in front of me on the table. And then my job was to label it with the black ink. And the other team members, they did other work. I was very fascinated that 5,000 years old artifacts from Mohenjo-Daro are passing from my hands. I saw a lot of stuff, broken handles of the jars, a broken, so many broken spouted cups, dishes, plates, dishes on stand, figurines, human figurines, male and female, birds, animals, toys, balls, cone-shaped, unidentifiable objects. There were so many things that were identifiable. The pottery itself, for instance, parts of the perforated jars. We don't talk about it, that what was the purpose of this, perforated pottery. So there were lots of fascinating things, and I was more fascinated to see when the other team members, where they were like putting these potsherds together, like puzzle pieces, putting them together and actually creating a jar out of that, reconstructing a jar or a plate or a dish on a stand. Beautiful pottery, they did. So it was a very good experience. I must mention two members of the team. One was Barbara Dales, George Dales' wife, very industrious woman, very intelligent and very friendly. She was definitely an asset to the team. And then Jonathan Mark Canoyer, who was at that time student of George Dales, and who at present is the project director of the Harappa project. Ever since George passed away, Mark has been working on the Harappa site. And by the way, the book that George Dales wrote, it is also co-authored by Mark Canoyer. So both Jonathan Mark Canoyer and George Dales, they had written this book. I find this book very important. I think it is the most important book after John Marshall's Indus Civilizations, 3 volumes that he wrote, because it does not only cover George Dales's findings, but also of Mortimer Wheeler's, because Leslie Alcock, who had worked with Mortimer Wheeler in the 1950s at Mohenjo-Daro, he had also contributed in that book, because there was, of course, a lot of pottery and artifacts that Mortimer Wheeler had not yet catalogued.
The artifacts that Parveen catalogued were the last of the finds from the store. Much of what was found has been stacked in museums, but scholars like Parveen have spent decades researching the material found to reconstruct the story of Mohenjo-Daro.